Imagine stepping out of your front door on a freezing morning. You look down at the fresh, pristine snow, and you see a trail of strange footprints.
Oh, that is just a terrifying thought.
Right, and they lead right out of the dark, dense woods, straight toward your remote farmhouse. But as you trace the path, your blood just runs cold.
Because there's only one set of tracks.
Exactly. They lead toward your home, but there are absolutely no footprints leading away.
I mean, it is the ultimate violation of sanctuary. That image instantly triggers our primal fight-or-flight response. Because it forces the realization that the threat isn't just out there in the cold unknown.
Yeah.
It has breached the perimeter. It is inside the house with you.
Well, for the Gruber family, that realization came far too late. Since you, the listener, probably already know the tragic fate of the Gruber household and their brand new maid at the Hinterkaifeck farm in March 1922, we aren't going to just rehash the basic timeline of the massacre today.
Right, we already know they were brutally slaughtered with a mattock, basically a heavy farming pickaxe.
Yeah, so today's mission for our deep dive is strictly focused on the who and the why. We are taking a magnifying glass to the most credible suspects in this century-old cold case.
And we're going to be deliberately contrasting the terrifying theories of an intimate inside job against the equally chilling prospect of local strangers and, well, drifting predators.
So what does this all mean? How do we even begin to systematically analyze a crime scene as utterly bizarre as this one?
Well, we start by dissecting the behavioral profile left behind by the killer. And to do that accurately, we have to look past the violence itself and really examine the psychological mechanisms of the aftermath.
The aftermath is the craziest part.
It really is. I mean, the sheer brutality of bludgeoning 6 people to death is staggering, but the post-crime reality is what makes Hinterkaifeck uniquely baffling in the annals of criminology. The perpetrator didn't just strike in a frenzy and flee into the night. They stayed.
And that is the detail that fundamentally rewrites how we have to look at this case. The killer lived at the farm for 3 or 4 days after the murders.
3 or 4 days.
Yeah, they lived among 6 corpses. And it wasn't just hiding out in a state of shock either. They systematically maintained the agricultural life of the property.
Right, they fed the cattle.
They fed the pigs, they milked the cows, they went into the family pantry, carved fresh meat, ate the entire household supply of bread, and kept the oven fires burning to heat the home.
Neighbors literally saw smoke casually drifting from the chimney over the weekend.
That's wild.
The psychology required to compartmentalize that reality is astonishing. You have someone who can systematically execute a family and then seamlessly transition into domestic farm chores.
Yeah.
And the prequel to the murder suggests this was a highly calculated operation. 6 months prior, the previous maid abruptly quit. She claimed she constantly heard footsteps in the attic and became firmly convinced the farm was haunted.
See, I'm looking at those prequel events, the strange noises, the footprints from the woods, the Munich newspaper found on the property that literally no one subscribed to.
The missing keys, too.
Exactly, the mysteriously vanished house keys. It reads less like a haunting and much more like a systematic stakeout. I mean, the previous maid wasn't dealing with ghosts. She was hearing a human predator physically living in the walls.
Removing roof tiles to create a sniper's nest lookout.
Yeah, literally studying their daily habits. I mean, I'm completely ruling out the idea of a standard burglary gone wrong.
Oh, for sure.
Burglars are opportunistic, high-anxiety offenders, When a home invasion spirals into a sextuple homicide, the intruder panics. They run.
They put as much distance between themselves and the bodies as possible.
Right. They absolutely do not stick around to act out a twisted, real-life Goldilocks scenario, eating the victim's food, warming themselves by the victim's fire, and feeding the victim's dog. It just doesn't happen.
It doesn't. And this raises an important question. What kind of psychological makeup allows someone to casually live among a slaughtered family, operate their machinery, and comfortably feed their livestock?
That behavioral clue logically demands we first look at suspects who are deeply, perhaps painfully, tied to the family's ecosystem. Someone like Lorenz Schlittenbauer.
Schlittenbauer is the natural starting point for the inside job theory. His ties to the family were just a tangled web of resentment and secrecy.
He was Victoria's neighbor, right?
Neighbor, but also her lover. Victoria was a widow. Her husband supposedly perished in the early days of World War I, and it was an open secret in the village that Schlittenbauer was like
alternatively, there could have been a violent, jealous rage concerning Victoria.
But his motive is almost secondary to his incredibly suspect behavior on April 4th, the day the bodies were discovered. His actions that day read like a masterclass in crime scene contamination and potential cover-up.
Oh, absolutely.
He initially sends his 2 young sons to the farm to check on the family. When they report back that the place is eerily quiet, Schlittenbauer doesn't go to the police. He gathers 2 neighbors and leads a makeshift search party.
And they break into the barn and discover the bodies stacked under hay and a wooden door. His neighbors are instantly horrified, obviously. They are physically repulsed by the carnage.
But Schlittenbauer's reaction,
Complete and utter indifference.
he doesn't flinch.
He doesn't. Instead, he starts casually moving the bodies around, completely destroying the integrity of the scene, and then he does something truly inexplicable.
He walks over to the front door of the main house.
Casually pulls a key out of his pocket, unlocks it, and enters the dark house entirely alone. And if we recall the timeline, Andreas Gruber had complained about missing house keys days before the murders.
Which is incredibly damning. When his completely bewildered neighbors asked why he would willingly walk into a dark house where a mass murderer might still be hiding, his excuse was that he needed to find his boy, Joseph. But the suspicious behavior didn't end in 1922. Fast forward 3 years to 1925. A local teacher happens upon Schlittenbauer lingering at the remains of the Hinterkaifeck farm, which had been demolished by that point.
And the teacher asks him why he's wandering around an empty field. And Schlittenbauer, completely unprompted, mentions that the killer's original attempt to bury the family's bodies underneath the barn was thwarted because the Bavarian ground was frozen solid.
The mechanics of that statement are just wild. How would anyone know the killer tried to dig a grave under the barn unless they themselves had struck the frozen earth with a shovel?
Seriously?
Schlittenbauer spent the remainder of his life weaponizing civil lawsuits against anyone in the village who dared call him the murderer, legally silencing his critics until he died in 1941.
Wow. But if we are examining intimate rage, Schlittenbauer isn't the only candidate. We also have to evaluate the dead husband, Carl Gabriel. Victoria's husband was officially reported killed in action in France in 1914, but his body was never recovered from the battlefield. The theory posits that Carl actually survived the chaos of the trenches, deserted the military, and just lived in the shadows.
And then eventually makes his way back to his farm in 1922, only to discover his wife is not only alive and well, but raising a new child fathered by a neighbor.
Right, and that betrayal triggers a catastrophic, vengeful rage.
The foundation for this theory relies heavily on accounts that emerged decades later following World War II. German war captives released from Soviet gulags consistently claimed that a Russian-speaking Soviet officer who clearly had intimate knowledge of Bavaria explicitly bragged to them about being the Hinterkaifeck murderer.
Wait, really? A Soviet officer?
Yeah. Adding weight to this, Carl Gabriel's fellow soldiers from WWI had previously noted his frequent bizarre fixations on deserting and relocating to Russia.
Man, it sounds like a Hollywood script. But the forensic evidence regarding the emotional violence inflicted on Victoria specifically lends it some credence. The autopsy revealed strangulation marks on Victoria's neck, combined with the most severe, frantic blows from the mattock.
Strangulation is a highly intimate, personal method of killing.
Yeah, it requires sustained, close quarters physical contact, which strongly points to deeply personal rage. But if we are searching for a source of deeply personal, localized rage, we cannot ignore the darkest secret of the Gruber household, the patriarch himself, Andreas.
The family dynamic was profoundly toxic. And this wasn't just local gossip, it is a matter of documented historical record. In 1915, Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were convicted in a court of law for carrying out an incestuous relationship.
It's so disturbing.
Andreas served a year in prison. He was universally known in the region as a violent, tyrannical man who physically abused his family and actively isolated them from the surrounding community.
Which fueled rampant rumors that young Joseph wasn't Schlittenbauer's son at all, but rather the product of Andreas's continued systemic abuse of his own daughter.
Exactly. Which opens the door to a family annihilator theory. What if Andreas finally discovered the truth about Joseph's paternity? Or what if Victoria threatened to expose him again?
So Andreas, a known violent abuser with a criminal record, just snaps.
He systematically murders his wife, his daughter, his grandchildren, and the maid to ensure there are absolutely no witnesses. And because he has literally isolated himself from the entire world, he has nowhere to run.
So he simply stays on his own farm, doing his own chores for the next 3 days. It perfectly explains why the killer was so comfortable operating the farm equipment.
The psychological profile of the family annihilator fits Andreas perfectly. However, the forensic reality of the crime scene heavily complicates that narrative.
How so?
When the pathologists conducted the autopsies, they determined that 5 of the victims were bludgeoned to death with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a horizontal blade. But Andreas Gruber's fatal injury was distinctly different.
Oh.
His carotid artery was severed because he fell, or was violently shoved, onto a heavy iron pickaxe that was resting in an animal feeding trough. The biomechanics of the fatal wounds simply don't match.
Okay, let's unpack this. If Andreas murdered his entire family and then decided to take his own life, he wouldn't accomplish it by accidentally falling neck first onto a completely different stationary tool in the barn.
No, that makes no sense.
So the theory has to evolve to make sense of the forensics. Like, Andreas murders the family in a rage. Schlittenbauer comes over to the farm a day later, discovers the bloodbath, and surprises Andreas in the barn.
Okay, I see where this is going.
In a desperate, retaliatory struggle, Schlittenbauer shoves the 63-year-old Andreas onto the pickaxe, killing him. Realizing his own biological son is already dead inside the house, Schlittenbauer leaves, deciding to keep the entire horrific sequence a secret to protect himself from prosecution.
That synthesized timeline elegantly bridges the gap between Schlittenbauer's incredibly suspicious cover-up behavior and Andreas's documented history of domestic violence.
But I keep running into a massive logical roadblock with the idea of Andreas as the primary architect of the massacre. Think about the logistics of the murders in the barn. 4 adults were lured out there, one by one, through the dark, connected stable.
Right.
How does a 63-year-old man physically overpower 4 people without at least one of them screaming, fighting back, or escaping into the woods?
That's a great point.
Unless the victims implicitly trusted the person walking up to them in the dark, they would have bolted. Given Andreas' history of tyrannical abuse, would his family really trust him leading them out to the barn late at night?
That exact logistical problem is why behavioral profilers, both in the 1920s and today, have never fully committed to the family annihilator theory. The strangulation of Victoria screams of intimate emotional brutality.
Yeah.
Yet the overall execution of the crime, systematically luring 6 people into a kill zone, dispatching them with brutal efficiency, and stacking their bodies like cordwood under a door, displays a level of mechanical coldness that is rarely seen in crimes of passion.
It's too methodical.
Way too methodical. That level of systematic detachment typically belongs to a predator looking from the outside in.
Which necessitates a hard pivot to the theories surrounding local strangers and drifters. If it wasn't a family member orchestrating a cover-up, who was lurking on the perimeter?
Well, we know the former maid, Crescence Reiger, gave investigators the names of several disgruntled former farmhands, men like the Bichler brothers and George Siegel.
Right, these were itinerant workers who had helped with the potato harvest at Hinterkaifeck.
They knew the intricate layout of the outbuildings. More importantly, they knew Andreas Gruber was a wealthy, paranoid man who didn't trust banks and kept large sums of cash hidden inside the house.
The testimony regarding these former workers is highly compelling. Reiger testified under oath that Anton Bichler harbored a deep resentment toward the Grubers, frequently stating that the family ought to be dead.
But the most crucial piece of evidence pointing toward Bichler involves the farm's fiercely protective Pomeranian watchdog.
Oh, the dog!
Yes. The mechanics of a farm dog's behavior are simple. They're trained to bark aggressively at any unfamiliar presence. Yet, Reiger specifically noted that the dog never once barked at Anton Bichler.
So the dog viewed him as part of the ecosystem.
Exactly. And his associate, George Siegel, had an even closer connection to the murder weapon. While employed at the farm, Siegel actually carved the wooden handle of the specific mattock used to crush the victim's skulls.
Wow, really?
He knew its exact weight, its balance, and precisely where it was stored in the barn.
But they weren't the only locals exhibiting predatory behavior. We also have the Thaler brothers, who were known throughout the region as opportunistic prowlers. The maid reported that Joseph Thaler literally stood outside her ground floor bedroom window late at night, subjecting her to a terrifying interrogation.
He was systematically probing for vulnerabilities. He demanded to know the family's exact sleeping arrangements, who occupied which room, where the entry points were, and exactly where the Grubers concealed their money.
It is the textbook operational prelude to a targeted, violent home invasion.
But the investigators eventually had to walk back the robbery motive, because a substantial amount of gold coins and paper currency was found completely untouched in the house.
Right, if the primary objective was a violent robbery, why leave the fortune behind?
Exactly. This contradiction opens the door to the true wild cards of the Hinterkaifeck investigation: politically motivated paramilitaries and wandering serial murderers. We have to contextualize the era.
Yeah, paint the picture for us.
This is 1922 in Weimar, Germany. The national economy is collapsing into hyperinflation. The military has been drastically reduced by the Treaty of Versailles, leaving thousands of traumatized, heavily armed men roaming the countryside.
Political violence is a daily reality.
And it's important to note, we're purely looking at the historical theories here, not endorsing any viewpoints, but that volatile environment spawned paramilitary factions like the Fly Club. The Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton, were heavily involved in the right-wing Freikorps overlay.
And they were wanted men, right?
They were actively wanted by authorities for the political assassinations of 9 farmers in Upper Silesia during the exact same time period. The ruthless, systematic eradication of the Hinterkaifeck household bears the unmistakable tactical hallmarks of trained paramilitaries who were deeply desensitized to slaughtering rural families without a second thought.
And then there is a theory that expands the scope of this mystery all the way across the Atlantic.
The American author theory.
Yes, Bill James, an American author, posits in his book The Man from the Train that the perpetrator was actually a German migrant serial killer named Paul Mueller. Mueller was the prime suspect in a string of identical, completely unsolved axe murders that decimated entire families across the United States, most notably the horrifying Villisca axe murders in Iowa.
The MO is strikingly similar.
His operational methodology matches Hinterkaifeck with terrifying precision. He exclusively targeted isolated rural homes. He always used the blunt edge of a found agricultural weapon. He meticulously stacked the victims' bodies, and he never stole a dime.
And James theorizes that when American law enforcement started connecting his crimes in 1912, Mueller simply boarded a ship and fled back to his homeland of Germany.
This psychological profile alignment is incredibly strong. The reliance on a weapon of opportunity found at the scene, the complete lack of financial motive, and the total eradication of the family unit. It fits Mueller perfectly. He was an organized, thrill-seeking family annihilator who traveled the rail networks, striking and vanishing.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
I am going to firmly push back on all of these outsider theories, whether it's the Freikorps assassins, a transatlantic serial killer like Paul Mueller, or local prowlers like the Thaylors.
Why is that?
If the killer was a wandering predator, why on earth would they risk detection to stay at the crime scene for days just to feed the pigs and the cows? The survival mechanism of a wandering predator is constant motion. They strike, they experience the thrill, and they move on to evade capture. Sticking around to care for livestock implies a deeply ingrained, localized agricultural mindset.
It implies someone who can look at a starving cow, even after bludgeoning 6 people to death, and think, I need to milk that.
Exactly. It brings this entire debate between the intimate insider and the cold outsider to a total boiling point.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have just articulated the exact paradox that has kept this case unsolved for over a century. The killer operated with the cold, mechanical detachment of a total stranger, efficiently stacking bodies and targeting a sleeping toddler.
Yet, simultaneously, they displayed the intimate operational knowledge and domestic comfort of a family member knowing where the bread was stored, how to draft the oven, and how to soothe the livestock. It completely defies traditional behavioral categorization.
It truly does. And the desire to categorize and solve this paradox has never failed. Which brings us to the modern investigation. Think about how hard it is to hide your digital or physical footprint today. Now imagine trying to retroactively analyze a ghost from 1922.
Nearly impossible.
But in 2007, students at the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy took the massive Hinterkaifeck case file and subjected it to modern forensic scrutiny. They used contemporary behavioral analysis, geographic profiling, and victimology to evaluate every single suspect we've discussed today.
And through that modern lens, they systematically ruled out everyone except for one prime suspect.
They essentially solved the puzzle to their own satisfaction, but because that individual had long since passed away, the Academy made the controversial decision to keep the name a tightly guarded secret, citing respect for the suspect's living descendants.
They proved the identity to themselves, closed the file, and refused to tell the public.
So we have to ask you, the listener, to evaluate the evidence. Based on a single set of footprints, the missing keys, the bizarre dedication to farm chores, and the incredibly dark family secrets, who do you think the Police Academy named?
Was it the vengeful, secretive lover Schlittenbauer? Was it the abusive, tyrannical patriarch Andreas? Or was it a phantom from the woods who slipped back into the shadows?
We are going to leave you with one final, highly unsettling historical detail to mull over regarding the desperation of this case. Immediately following the autopsies in 1922, the court physician actually decapitated all 6 of the victims.
What?
He systematically removed their skulls and shipped them to Munich. And the reasoning wasn't based on emerging forensic science. The authorities in Weimar Germany were so utterly paralyzed by the lack of evidence that they handed the victims' heads over to local clairvoyants. They were relying on the spiritualist movement, hoping the supernatural could provide answers where human logic and police work had completely failed.
And let me guess, the clairvoyants saw nothing.
The clairvoyants, of course, saw nothing. The silence of the dead remained unbroken. And then, during the chaos and widespread bombings of World War II, the skulls were completely lost in the rubble of Munich.
That is incredibly tragic.
Which means that today, the Gerber family